pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Today is Monday, February 12th, and the time is 5:31 p.m. Special meeting of the City Council, Board of Zoning Appeals, and Planning Commission is called to order. At this time, please silence all electronic devices. To comply with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the city requests participants in this meeting complete a voluntary anonymous survey that is available on the table in the back of the room. Since we have no old business, we'll go straight to new business. We have KK for the planning workshop and the UDO training.
All right. Hello, everybody. It is KK, 2 initials. If you haven't met me before, my hometown is Kokomo, so now you will remember that all night, correct? So I was part of the team that worked on the Unified Development Ordinance, which was went into effect the first of the year. And part of what I like to do is when we have a new ordinance, is go in and kind of walk the users, the planning officials, which is the Planning Commission, the BZA, and the council, and any staff members through it. So you know what's there, what's changed, where it is. And then I like to apply it. So we're going to end up tonight with a couple of fake, very fake, totally made up cases that you will need to look at and try to use what you've learned to make a decision. So that's what we're after tonight. Okay, apparently what you have in your handouts, the pages may be off a little bit, so you may have to.
You're just going to have every other page.
You're going to have every other page apparently, but everything is on the screen, it's all there. So bear with us as we take a further look at that, and just keep your eyes on the screen. So your new Unified Development Ordinance, which is zoning and subdivision all together in one document. They're no longer 2 separate ordinances. They're one ordinance, the Unified Development Ordinance. It has, the first chapter is honestly a bunch of legalese about this. Chapter 2 is all the zoning districts. We'll look at that in more detail. Chapter 3 is site development standards. That's things like parking standards, etc. Chapter 4 is use standards, standards that we have for certain uses that are basic standards or requirements. Chapter 5 is where we get into subdivision standards. Chapter 6 is one that you all will be very interested in. Who are my Plan Commission members in here? Okay, Chapter 6 goes through the subdivision processes. Chapter 7 goes through the zoning processes, so rezonings, things like that. So Plan Commission, BZA, your variances are covered in this chapter. Who are my BZA members? Okay, so you're going to look at Chapter 7 for a lot of the information there. And council, when you do a rezoning, that's also going to be found in Chapter 7. Chapter 8 is nonconformities. Again, a reminder, when we adopted the new ordinance, everything that was legally in place becomes legally nonconforming. They don't have to comply with these new requirements. So they are all good, the existing stuff that was legal. If it was illegal, it's still illegal, okay? If it's in violation, still in violation. But the stuff that was done legally is non-conforming. So they would not have to conform with this unless they tore everything down, rebuilt it, wanted to add a huge addition on. That kind of thing is covered in Chapter 8, what those parameters are. Chapter 9 is enforcement, violations, and remedies. There's no point in having an ordinance if there is no enforcement of that ordinance. So that is something that we talked a lot about with staff. That's covered in Chapter 9. And then Chapter 10 probably isn't a super exciting, sexy one for you guys, but it's where all the definitions are. That's where we're defining what is a use variance, things like that. That's in Chapter 10. So now you know where everything is in this new chapter. This is what we're going to run through tonight. And again, I'm just going to kind of talk through some changes, and then we'll get to the practice session at the end. So, changes to the development process. And when I say development process, we're talking about zoning and subdivisions. One of the big things that we talked about with staff was the need to start doing pre-application meetings. There were too many times where people would come in after having spent time and resources trying to prepare the wrong thing because they hadn't talked to staff, or they brought in incomplete things, or we didn't get the whole picture, so they were at Plan Commission 1 month and then again another month after that, or BZA, multiple months. So we're trying to require, and this is very common in Indiana now, a sit down, whether it's virtual or in person, with staff before anything is filed. And then Sarah can say, okay, this is the type of subdivision plat you are, these are the steps you're going to need to do, we've got to do the rezoning before we do this subdivision, or the rezoning before we do variances. All that is something that's figured out in this required pre-submittal meeting. And again, I have used this myself. I have in the past been the acting planner, like for Avon, Indiana, and other places where we had done this. And it really makes a huge difference in being able to help not only the city to make sure you guys know what the big picture and the final end goal is, but also the applicant to make sure they're on the right page. So Sarah has the ability to call in others to the meeting depending on, you know, if she gets a whiff that it may be something that she needs some engineering input on or fire input on or something. It isn't necessarily just limited to her, that's at her discretion. So that's a big change right at the beginning. We developed these little flow charts, which are not in the ordinance, but they're in handouts that applicants will get that show the steps that you go through. And you've got that for all the different processes that we're going to be doing under zoning and subdivision. What I'm showing you here is a new thing called a minor subdivision process. Before, you had a one-size-fits-all type of subdivision process, which was really more than what you need if you're doing something simple. We decided to do something where if you have 4 lots or less, you're not building new streets, you're not extending public facilities, water, sewer, that kind of thing, that you can do a minor subdivision process. And the beauty is that normally, those of you that are my Plan Commission members, you know normally there's a primary that goes to the Plan Commission for a public hearing, and then a secondary that the applicant has to come back with and make another filing. A minor subdivision, legally, you can combine that in one step. So it saves a lot of time and resources for applicants. We're sorting out the simple stuff that doesn't need as much time and so forth. Now, one thing you'll notice up here is there's an orange box up there, and it says Technical Review Committee review. we are in this ordinance relying a lot more on the technical review committee to do the pre-review of the technical kinds of items like subdivisions. What do we look at in subdivisions? We look at access, we look at drainage, we look at all those kind of things that we don't expect the plan commission to know all about. So you're gonna be looking for a recommendation from your in-house experts on that.
I have a question. So we just did a primary, secondary plat at the planning commission meeting last week. And it was a lot and just like a 1.5 acres of it was split off. No new infrastructure or anything like that on it. Now, we did not have a technical review meeting because it was just simply this one business wanted to buy it from this other gentleman that owns it. Just, you know, for down the road in case he would decide to expand, you know, what he has. Is that something that we have to have a technical review?
I recommend doing it even if you spend only 5 minutes on it, just so you could say, oh, wait a minute, there is an easement that's not showing up here, or we need an easement here, or whatever, just to make sure that all the Ts are crossed and the Is are dotted. So just getting those extra pair of eyes on it, again, you don't have to spend a lot of time, but just making sure everybody gets a look at it is probably, I would err on that side. Okay, so we have this new minor subdivision process. The thing to remember about subdivisions is, according to Indiana State Code and to case law, if a subdivision meets your local standards in your ordinance, you must approve it. There's no discretionary ability to deny a subdivision. So it doesn't matter if all the neighbors don't like it. Under the legal standards, you have to approve it if it meets your ordinance and your local standards. So that is, if you don't do that, then you are opening the city up to lawsuits. So there's plenty of case law about this, so just be aware. So what the technical review committee again is doing is making sure that their pieces meet the standards, okay, before they report out to the plan commission. And so we're really looking at how this fits with the ordinance standards. One of the other things that's new in your new Unified Development Ordinance is, most of us know the BZA handles zoning variances. So if you don't want to comply with the standards in the zoning portion of the ordinance, you go to the Board of Zoning Appeals. But if you don't want to comply with the if you don't want to comply with the subdivision ordinance requirements, you don't go to the BZA under Indiana law, you go to the Plan Commission. And so we have formalized that in your ordinance and recognized that from state law. State law tells us that it's up to local governments to set criteria for a subdivision waiver. So we have done that in your new Unified Development Ordinance. BZA members, you know about criteria for variances. Now you have similar criteria that relate to subdivision waivers. So again, the other thing that we added in was, if somebody wants a waiver that would waive or defer public improvements, they have to even meet additional criteria. So it's not a, I want this because it's gonna save me money as a developer, or it's something I just don't feel like doing, or it's Tuesday and I don't like Tuesdays. You have to have a good reason for it. What is unique about your property that means you can't follow the same rules that we want everybody else to follow? And there are situations where that works, because you've got weird slopes, or you may have, the city came in and took most of your front yard as right of way, or who knows, you know, what that situation is, but it has to be something that is justified through these criteria to make this make sense. So again, that has been codified in the ordinance, and then we have another thing that's new. This is something called a development plan, and that is basically a site plan. So we are requiring site plans, and that is something that's done internally. So the staff and the technical review committee are basically going to be, for every project that comes in, looking at the site plan and sitting down and putting their eyes on it to make sure that fire access works, emergency access works, with the parking lot layout, and that they're meeting all the other standards in the ordinance. It's not something that has to legally come to the Plan Commission. The administrator, if there is an appeal, the applicant is able to appeal the administrator's decision, but it is meant to be an internal process where you're looking at, again, the ordinance standards. And as with subdivisions, if it meets all the standards in the ordinance, Sarah has to approve it. She can't just say, I don't like that color or whatever on the building. It is guided by what's in your ordinance. So this is, again, just to make sure there are more eyes looking at it, that everything is done that matches the ordinance. Yeah?
This is for every new house that's built too?
No.
So
No.
this is just
So
for
this is-
commercial stuff?
This is not for single-family
Okay.
homes, right?
It's what we currently do.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I didn't know that it had changed for.
Yeah, so this is, again, it's something that you may have been kind of doing before, but it wasn't really enabled in your ordinance, so now we are backing up that state statute in your local ordinance by saying Greensburg chooses to do this. So it's being what we call enabled in your ordinance. Again, I touched on this, we have this new technical review committee. Technical review committee never makes a final decision. They're a recommending body, they're your technical experts. You're going to be using it for subdivisions review, development plan or site plan review that we just talked about. But the BZA can also ask them to take a look at it for special exceptions and variances. Or actually, the BZA doesn't even have to ask them. Sarah will just have the technical review committee looking at it for those things. So, again, the members are city staff and other agencies that normally do the review, and they'll make some recommendations. This is not gonna allow us to get the fire trucks in that parking lot, the way it's laid out, things like that. All right, so one thing that we want to talk a lot about tonight is, I've already talked about if something meets all the subdivision criteria in your ordinance, you've got to approve it. If something meets all the developmental standards criteria or the site plan criteria, Sarah has to approve it. But there are also criteria that we get from state law for things, so we're going to talk about what those are and who they guide. And so we'll start at the very top. City Council makes the final decision for rezonings. Indiana state law requires that decision to be based on 5 things. And that is also for the Plan Commission's recommendation. So those things are listed in Indiana state law. And it's not 3 out of 5 or the best of 5. You have to meet all 5. And that is backed up by lots of case law in Indiana. So if you are granting things that only meet 4 out of 5 criteria on this, you're setting the city up to be sued by somebody. And I don't think any of us as public officials would want that to happen. So it's really important to know what these state law criteria are and to follow those criteria. And you'll have a chance to do that tonight when we do our practice. And you'll see some of these in more detail. So you'll see what all those 5 things are. Those criteria have been repeated in your Chapter 7. These have not changed from Indiana state law since at least the 1960s. I don't think there's any move to change them. These are pretty well ingrained. So we are repeating them in your local ordinance just to make it easier for applicants and neighbors and everybody else to figure out what the requirements are for it. We also do go ahead and cross-reference state law too in the ordinance. Plan commission members, as we've mentioned, the criteria for approving a subdivision plat are the standards in your ordinance. Very clear. The subdivision waiver criteria are listed in Chapter 6. On that one, state law says make up your own criteria at the local level. So the criteria for, I don't know, if you think about Floyd County or New Albany where they've got escarpment or something, is going to maybe have some other special things that you may not have to adopt here in Greensburg. So they allow local governments to set their own criteria. You will find plan commission members, when somebody asks you to waive their standards for the subdivision, you'll be guided by Chapter 6 and what's in Chapter 6. And then Board of Zoning Appeals. When you have 2 different types of variances that you handle. You have the development standards variance. Those are things like setbacks and height and number of parking spaces and things like that. Those are guided again by Indiana code. The state law says, here are the things that you will use to review this. And as with the rezoning, you have to meet all those things. So again, this is Indiana code and case law backs it up. So it's again going to be found in Chapter 7, and we're cross-referencing the state code also. The next type of variance that you guys may see is a use variance, and that is to allow a use that's not normally allowed in that zoning district. That's a very, very unusual variance. You may see it with a historic building that's in that was built before current zoning was ever in place or something like that, so it maybe doesn't fit into its residential surroundings if it's an old mom and pop corner store or something. They're not an everyday kind of thing, so you probably don't see a lot of these. But again, state law says, here are the criteria, 5 criteria we want you to use. How many of those criteria must the BZA find met to be able to grant a use variance? Are you paying attention? How many out of 5? 5 out of 5, very good. You guys are with me, you're awake. All right, so again, cross-referencing state law, telling you it's in Chapter 7. The other thing that Board of Zoning Appeals may be seeing more of is special exceptions. Those are uses that are sometimes what I call our tricky land uses. It's up to each community to figure out what land uses they want to make special exceptions. And the key is that you get to look at them on a case-by-case basis to make sure that that tricky use fits on that site. So we're making sure whatever those tricky uses are, if you look in your ordinance, there's a land use table that will have SE in the table, so you'll have all the zoning districts listed and then all the land uses. When you see it SE, that means special exception. It must go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, and the Board of Zoning Appeals will look at it after the Technical Review Committee helps them review it and say, okay, it looks like it meets all the criteria or it doesn't meet all the criteria. The criteria here is another situation where state law says it's up to you guys to develop your own criteria. So the state says, we want criteria for this, but you develop them yourself. So they are in chapter 7. We came up with some pretty typical criteria. Again, we weren't reinventing the wheel. What you see across the state of Indiana is pretty much standardized for these kind of things. So we pulled some of that, and that's how we ended up with where we are today. So I want you to take away from this that the decisions that you make are not meant to be random decisions, and they're meant to be based on legal criteria that in most cases the state has already set up for you to use. And in other cases, the state has said, okay, set them up yourself, but put them in your local ordinance, which we have done. So all these criteria for council, plan commission, BCA, for all these different development processes are in your ordinance, and you'll be looking in chapter 7 for all the zoning type criteria, and chapter 6 for all the subdivision type criteria. All right, there's a new tool that we also want to talk about for a minute. Sometimes you have something before you and you want to approve it subject to a condition. A short-term condition might be, we're going to approve this subdivision plat subject to you correcting the error in the drainage calculation as requested by the city. Okay, that's not a super unusual condition. But sometimes we need conditions that are permanent conditions. Like if the BZA is hearing a variance request and somebody has a narrower lot and they don't want to require or have the setback that they would normally have on a side lot line, maybe the BZA says, okay, we'll reduce your setback, but we want you to have a screening fence up there instead because you're not going to have that separation. So we want the screening fence to help act as a noise and a view buffer there. So that is something that might be a permanent condition. And to make sure that that goes with the property and the next property buyer knows about it, state law has something called a written commitment. These commitment tools are recorded in the county's recorder's office so that new property buyers will know of them. They're not a secret. They don't get lost in the records over the years. So this is, again, something that most communities in Indiana have now adopted in their local ordinances. So we have a new permanent condition, which is called, what's it called? Read the slide. Written commitment. So as you make decisions on things and you think about conditions that you might need to attach to make something work, whether it's a special exception, whether it's a rezoning, whether it's a variance, whatever it is, you can make this permanent condition as part of it. Okay, so you might have a rezoning that is on a really unusual, like a very narrow corner lot. And it might make sense for some of the uses in a certain zoning district, but you might have concerns about somebody if they wanted to put a car wash on that corner or something that might not work with all the traffic. So you might have a written commitment with a rezoning that says you can never have a car wash on this property, and then future buyers would know that. So it's a tool, again, that you can use with your approvals. It's eligible for BZA, the Plan Commission, and for council to use. The applicant does not have to agree with that tool. That's part of the requirement for approval. So it is, again, enabled by Indiana state law.
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
So, if we decide, to decide on something to be a written commitment, what does it take then for me to, I know you have some electricity, the standard one.
Right. So what most communities do is the attorney for the city or county or town will draw up kind of a standard fill in the blank legal form that then can have whatever that permanent condition is added to that, and then taken and recorded in the recorder's office. You get a copy of that with everything. But again, your attorney doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. They can just see what other communities have done out there, because most of them have this tool now. And if you start letting everybody create their own language to go with it, it's going to get really crazy and hard to understand over the years. So I would say start with that. Just have them do a little homework and modify one that you find out there. Okay. And if somebody doesn't, in the future, doesn't think that's needed anymore, doesn't want it anymore, whatever, to get rid of that permanent condition, that written commitment, you have to go back to the body that put it in place. So if it was a condition from the BZA for that setback variance, and then the person ends up buying the lot next door so they own the adjoining lot, maybe they think they don't need it anymore. If they don't want it, they come back to the BZA and ask for that to be removed. So that's how that process works. One of the big things that we talked about in the beginning that I remember with Sarah is that there are a lot of things just kind of hanging around that were approved years ago, but things were never done with them. We see that a lot. I have a term that I made up, but I think it's fun, called zombie subdivisions, where you have subdivisions that were approved before the recession and then they never got built, and they don't even come close to meeting whatever community's current requirements are, but they're still kind of hanging out there. So what we have done is set expirations for everything that we can. Rezoning does not have an expiration, but other things do now. So these site plans, the development plans that Sarah's looking at in-house, those will expire in 3 years as long as construction begins in a year. So somebody can't come in and just do something and then come in 10 years later and say, okay, I'm ready to go now.
So if we've done a technical review meeting on development plan or something, and if they haven't started construction on it, the owner's assignments, then we can say, well, we got to start over again.
Yeah.
But if they've started on it, but they haven't completed it yet, then it expires in 3 years.
Yeah, if they've started on it, they get the 3 years. If they haven't started on it in a year, then they're out of luck. So they've gotta get that permit pulled and, yeah.
Ma'am,
Yeah,
is this retroactive?
no, it's not.
Okay.
So this is again for new development that's coming in, not for things that were already filed. If something was already filed and is under the old ordinance and it was submitted before the January 1st date, then it's got that grace.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we can't clean up what's already done, but we can keep it from happening in the future. So we have, for the BZA stuff, the special exception development standards and use standards. They have 3 years for any construction to begin. If there's no construction needed, the structure has to be occupied within 2 years. And if there are conditions, commitments, or temporary conditions, those have to be met within 1 year. So again, that's all spelled out in your ordinance. Major subdivisions, primary plats, big major subdivisions now expire in 3 years if they don't do that second step, that secondary plat approval. And then once they start, if they do not substantially complete sections within 6 years, it expires. So if they complete a section, then they have, how long do you think to complete the next one based on that?
This is after the secondary plat approval?
the secondary plat approval. Basically, as long as you keep doing sections, if you do a section, then you've got a new lease of life on the next section, and so on and so on. Sorry?
6 years per section.
Yeah, but if you don't, and you just walk away, then you lose that. So if a plat stops, as we saw in other communities and maybe here, like with the recession, everything stops, developer goes bust, whatever, it's not allowed to just be forever. So there is some expiration that goes with that. Minor subdivisions, because we're not looking at new roads or new infrastructure with that, we did not put an expiration date on those. So you can do it and then tinker around and eventually get it recorded, and you know, maybe you don't even need any building permits or whatever. So we're not messing with minor subdivisions because it's usually neighbors who are buying each other's property or something like that. So the idea again is for new stuff, it's not going to be there forever. Let's take a look at what happens with zoning districts. Colors here may be a little overwhelming. One thing that is a big change is we deleted the agricultural zoning district. Most cities and towns don't have an agricultural zoning district because it's not a primary land use like it is in counties or rural areas. And so we had an exercise with our steering committee where we sat down and looked at the zoning maps and kind of talked about what was happening and everything. And we all came to the consensus that really that agricultural zoning district wasn't needed. You can still farm other property that is zoned differently. You can still do row crops on any of these zoning districts, but we really are not trying to preserve agricultural land within the city, and there's really no need for that agricultural zoning district either. One of the other things that changed in the middle of that, you'll see a light pink color, PN neighborhood business. That's a new commercial zoning district that we added that's meant to be a smaller scale kind of thing. So it's a small business meant to serve a neighborhood, like a coffee shop or something like that. There are some size restrictions involved. It's not going to be a massive drive-through or anything like that. So it's meant to be at a scale that matches residential around it. You've probably heard about mixed-use development. So the trend is we're seeing a lot more of that. It may come to Greensburg. You may get a developer who wants to put some commercial in with their residential development. And this is the kind of thing that would be really useful for that. We also added a new institutional district, that turquoise color that you see there, IN1. You all did not have an institutional zoning district. Institutional means schools, hospitals, government buildings, things like that are institutional. Most cities and towns have enough of those things that they have an institutional zoning district. So again, that was one thing we said probably makes sense for you guys as a city to add that one. The other thing that happened is just we renamed your residential zoning districts. So we did not change them, we just renamed them. So R1 is no longer R1 one family residential, it's now R1 lowest density residential. The reason we did that is because there have been court cases about what the definition of family is. We can't control relationships and families and so forth, so we're just trying to make it a little safer and more realistic by talking about more the density, which really describes it better than how many families might be living in the homes. But we still have all those zoning districts just slightly renamed a little bit. Okay, so that's just kind of bringing it into the modern ages. This is an example of that land use chart that I mentioned that's in Appendix A of the ordinance. And so along the top, you have all these different zoning districts, and along the side, you've got different land uses. So you can follow that over, and if you look at them, you can see where you have P, that's permitted uses, so it's allowed by right as long as you get your permits and everything. You don't have to go to Plan Commission or BZA for approval on that. You still have to get a development plan approval, but as long as you meet the standards, that use is allowed. SE means, what do you think SE means? Special exception, very good. The one that you may not get is on the bottom row, you'll see US. US means use standards. So that's a clue to people that there may be additional standards for that particular use, and you need to look in the ordinance for that. So we'll get a chance to take a look at that and try that out a little bit later tonight, but that's what everybody's going to be looking at to figure out what uses go where. These are all listed in your individual zoning districts. So you can go to that 2-page spread in chapter 2 and see what the uses are allowed in that zoning district. But this is a handy tool, because if you're trying to figure out which of all the different zoning districts you might be able to have a certain use in, you can go across this chart and say, okay, here's 4 of them that will allow that, or 4 of them allow it by right, and 1 of it allows it only as a special exception. So it's just an easier way to find that information, depending on what you're looking for. There's also an Appendix B. Appendix B is dimensional standards. Again, it's not new information, it's just organized to make it easier to find. So this has things like accessory structure sizes and setbacks and things like that on it that you'll take a look at here. Now let's take a look at some of the changes in site development standards. We spent some time again with the steering committee going through these appearance kind of things. And what we did was kind of look at what other communities in Indiana were doing. We talked it through. What you guys have is what I would call architectural standards light. So architectural standards light are things like, if you build a new primary structure, you have to face the road with it. We don't want to see the back of the building where you've got your dumpsters and stuff like that. So that is an example of what's written in the ordinance for these architectural standards. Major residential subdivisions now require an anti-monotony plan. That means that you can't have single-family houses next to each other all down the block that look exactly the same. There may be 4 different house plans and you flip some of them or whatever, but that's something that is all talked through in the requirements. There are some building materials that are now prohibited in some building districts. For example, you could not build a house of concrete blocks. So these are pretty minimal but basic standards that everyone agreed to. And then one of the other things that we felt was really important when we did this was to make sure for infill development, things that were going in on lots that were empty lots in the middle of an old neighborhood, or where somebody was doing a tear down and rebuilding, that what was put in there matched what was around it. So for example, if you've got a new home going in an old residential block, we want to make sure it is following the same kind of setbacks that those houses had. If the other houses had front porches or were 2 stories, that same kind of outline would apply for this new infill development.
So another question.
Yeah.
So on that, let's say my home burned down and I was in an older established neighborhood and I want to rebuild it. I don't have to come before the DZA to get setback variance
No.
as long as it, it matches up. Because we don't want a house to be set way back.
Right, and that's exactly why we did it. There's an average setback standard that's now in the ordinance so that you can build your house at the same setback that the rest of the houses on the block have and not have to follow a standard that maybe applies in a new subdivision that makes no sense in the hometown. Yeah, exactly.
Excuse me, but in the same breath, it's like, if you're on a block with all 2-story homes and my house burns down, then you're telling me that I have to build a 2-story house?
We're telling you that you have to match what's in that block, yeah. So, again, that is something that we talked through with the committee, and I would say give it a try and see how it goes. But the idea is that you don't want somebody bringing in a modular home in a historic block and putting it in there.
Well, putting in a modular home and building new homes, that's different.
We can't legally say it's different. Legally, it's the same thing under Indiana law.
Okay, the other thing was this, on the monotone thing, so you're saying like, what about the housing, the duplexes that we have out?
This is
Outside
for single family subdivisions. This is like major single family subdivisions, so that we just don't have all the same houses. It can be, you guys get to approve what the developer's plan is. They may have, again, it may just be that they've got 3 or 4 types and they just flip it every once in a while. But this is just to keep, and there's a whole list of things, if you look at the ordinance, that they can do to differentiate. It could be that their entrance is different. It could be all kinds of different things.
Garage is placed different.
What's the purpose?
The purpose is that the studies have shown that it makes the property values higher.
It just looks a lot nicer than your cookie cutter homes that are exactly the same one after, the other.
Right. So it makes a difference in single family homes. And again, it's in your ordinance. It's there. It's been adopted. Try it out. If you don't like it, you can amend your ordinance. But you've got to follow it now because it's a local law.
And this is for future development. We can't go back on anybody that's already
Right.
there.
This is new
just
stuff that comes
from
in.
now moving forward.
And I'm sorry you didn't catch that in the draft of the public hearing, because apparently you're concerned about that. But it's now part of the local law. So it may be that there are other things that you all don't like, but you've got to remember it's the local law, and you can't just ignore it if you don't like it. Try it out. If you really think it doesn't work, come in. But that's the way it is right now. We are not talking about things that are just policies. We're talking about actual laws. Okay, that's what this is. So that's the way it's set. And again, this is stuff that went through your steering committee and that we talked about before. And again, if you missed it, I apologize for that, but it's not a secret new thing. Landscape requirements. Most communities have landscape standards across the state of Indiana. Nothing new about that. Yours, again, are what I would call fairly light. You now have to have a landscape plan that's submitted for approval. It does require some parking lot landscaping now. There's different kinds of buffers between certain uses, with the idea that if you've got a commercial or industrial use next to a residential use, there's probably going to be some conflict. So there's some separation, there's some landscape plantings and so forth, or some fencing that may be required. Depending on what those things are, there's again a chart that's in your ordinance that tells, like for single family next to single family, there is no buffer. But when you get up to really big differences, like single family to industrial, there has to be some kind of a separation there. Major residential subdivisions now have a perimeter buffer around them. So that is something that's fairly common when you get these big residential subdivisions. It helps a little bit when you're driving down the road. You're not gonna see everybody's laundry or backyard or whatever, so it helps a little bit that way. We are not requiring tree preservations, but we did set up some incentives in there to make it attractive for people to preserve trees. And we are now requiring some minimal plantings around buildings, foundation plantings. Again, this is not for single family, this is for commercial and industrial uses. This is kind of the bare minimum that we see in the state of Indiana. So you guys are not doing anything near what a lot of other communities are doing, but you really weren't doing much before. And that was something that we talked a lot about. Sarah had extra meetings and so forth to go through some of these things. Sign requirements, one of the big issues that we found when we came here is that your sign ordinance was not compliant per the United States Supreme Court. So that was the big motivator as we wrote this, was to make it apply and comply with federal case law. And we won't get into all